The Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 are, shockingly, next-generation hardware. And being next-gen, they don't just bring with them more CPU grunt and more RAM, they also bring a fundamental shift in the architecture of those systems. And this will enable developers to tap into things like the SSD for much faster load times and almost instantaneous access to tons of data, as well as the ability to run hardware-based ray tracing on their games, which also is going to definitely be a massive change for games in terms of how you can create them and effects, realism. It's going to be pretty damn impressive. But there's been an awful lot of questions and confusion as to the PlayStation 5 and its GPU, not least of which what hardware features does the PS5 support. And this has been even more confusing because of what we thought was a Sony employee state that the PS5 was somewhere between RDNA 1 and RDNA 2. Now, at the time, it was very unclear whether this was an actual employee of Sony or someone making a troll account, basically just, well, pretending to be this individual. Well, I got asked a lot regarding this and my thoughts and opinions of the PS5, because one of the things I've stated consistently is not only is the PS5 RDNA 2 based, but it also has some hardware features which have been specifically customized for Sony, which in some instances are actually more advanced than RDNA 2. Well, as of the time, there was a couple of reasons I didn't say anything. The first is because, quite honestly, there was a ton on my plate. I was dealing with a Ryzen 3300X review, and I'm still actually tackling the last bits of a RX 5600 XT review, with the former being from AMD themselves. I'm working on a project for them, and the latter being a kind of collab with MSI. So there's that's been going on, plus as well a couple of other scripts. And also, I didn't really just want to make a video for drama's sake. I wanted to do some in-depth investigations, speak to more sources, and get out a decent video, which I think has got a bit more, let's say, research into it. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. I'll also mention that Moore's Law is Dead actually recently contacted me via DM, and I did tell him a few things, including the hardware-based ray tracing information, which I'll go into later in this video, although I stressed to him that I was very uncertain about this information because it did not come from one of my, let's say, more reliable sources, and indeed it came from a less, let's say, a source that I'm not so certain about. So I will cover that information plus a lot more in this video, but with that said, let's just get on with this. There's a lot of confusion for folks regarding the architecture and feature sets of the PS5, and honestly, I don't blame people for being confused. Much of this stems initially from leaked internal AMD testing results, which were placed on GitHub by an AMD employee. This by itself is not unusual. GitHub is often used by companies to share data, but the mistake that was made was that these results were made public, and in these results an early revision of the PS5 GPU was being tested, and several RDNA 2 features were disabled along with a lot of the specific PS5 customizations, not least of which being variable rate shading was disabled along with hardware-based ray tracing. Also, in these results were other GPU and things too, but I will not be showing much of this in this video because I want to stick within fair usage guidelines, and therefore I will be redacting certain parts of this information too because of other reasons, including privacy of individuals whose names are listed in the documentation, as it's their job to test specific functions of the bring up of the GPU. The GitHub results though, well, in several areas were accurate. For example, the number of compute units of being 40 active on the GPU, although Sony has disabled some of these for the PS5 for purposes of yields. I've also been told, by the way, that the yields on the 7nm process for both the PS5 and Xbox are fantastic, which is why I speculated about a possible spec bump. I'll link to that video in the description of the video. Of course, we also learn other aspects of the GPU too, such as the ability for Sony to disable compute units or run at different clock frequencies for the purpose of backwards compatibility. For example, running a PS4 vanilla game, the GPU would disable all but 18 CU and run at just 800 MHz, and all of this tallied up perfectly with several patents filed by Sony, which had been published to the public. There were also a variety of different PC IDs and things which were discovered by folks such as Comanche on Rogame, both of whom are on Twitter, and are really brilliant at finding things that companies would rather you not know about. Given the early nature of the hardware and also the fact that PC IDs and device IDs are routinely hidden, this is, by the way, becoming an increasingly big problem, which Rogame has definitely been having issues with the PC IDs of RDNA 2, in other words Navi 2X. But this really isn't a big deal and doesn't really tell you the generation of the GPU. For example, a lot of AMD RDNA 2 GPUs are being reported as RDNA 1, and it's really confusing, especially with some of the Apple custom work. Either way, what we're basically saying here is this is early hardware. So why is it that the PS5 had these features disabled? Yet, Sony and AMD are claiming the GPU is RDNA 2 compliant. And I'm saying that the PS5 can run hardware-based ray tracing, and not just me, developers too. Well, in a nutshell, the early silicon had features disabled because they weren't running correctly. Thanks to the GitHub information and also speaking to a few of my sources who have previously been extremely reliable in the past, including leaking some of the initial RDNA 2 information to me, I can provide rough details of the PS5 APU bring-up, but I'm being asked to omit several specific key details, unfortunately. To be clear from the start, and I want to make this abundantly clear, the PS5 GPU did not have features like hardware-based ray tracing tacked on the last minute. This is impossible. It would require major reworks, and you can't just implement it late into the silicon. Roadmaps and chips can take several years of work, as AMD themselves have stated. When a chip is first conceived, they're basically making guesses and gambles for 3 to 5 years into the future. Where will the industry head? What developers and end users will want? And of course that everything will come together, such as, say, fabs being able to mass produce the chips at sufficient yield at a specific die size. A great example of this gamble is with Zen 2, which launched a year-ish ago with the Ryzen 3000 series, using TSMC's 7nm process. Seriously, please stop saying these features were tacked on the last minute. It makes hardware engineers just laugh at the absurdity of these statements. It just is impossible. I was also the first to leak the Ryzen 3000 release date, along with the shared launch of the RX 5000 RDNA 1. Further to this, before the chips launched, one of my sources had told me that AMD engineers were getting frustrated with RDNA 1 and had called the chip a nightmare. It had undergone several respins, tweaks and optimizations in design to fix issues, especially I believe with the memory. And frankly, it was not smooth sailing when crafting these chips for the desktop. I had also, back in March of last year, 2019, if you're watching this in the far-flung future, leaked several features that would come for later Navi revisions, Navi 2, aka RDNA 2. This would include hardware-based ray tracing. This came from two other sources who were familiar for AMD's GPU roadmap, and they also informed me that AMD was splitting their GPU product lines into a more compute-focused GPU, which was codenamed Arcturus, but now is better known as CDNA, and the other being focused on gaming, which was RDNA and its successors. Indeed, AMD themselves admitted that Zen 2 was a big leap in IPC over the older architectures because features were originally intended to be implemented in Zen 1 had been held back because they were not ready to be implemented, and so this became part of Zen 2. I've since been told by a source that RDNA 1 was a nightmare, as I mentioned, and because of this, some of the features with RDNA 1 were held back for RDNA 2. I wasn't told specifics as to those features, but, and this is a guess, variable rate shading would be a great example of this. With the PS5 then, we saw 3 major revisions of the chip, and I'm only going to focus purely on the GPU, just so that we're clear. So the CPU side, that can go jump for a minute. I'm only talking about the GPU. The first was Aerial, and we saw early leaks of this from folks such as Komachi, and there was a lot of speculation if it was actually for a console APU, and if so, for which company? Was it Microsoft? Was it Sony? Could it even be for Nintendo? Unlikely, but possibly. Hell, maybe it's for an entirely different company. The Aerial GPU was a very, very early implementation of the chip. Essentially at this point, CU numbers were basically decided, as were the features of the chip, but the functionality of it, well, yeah, it wasn't really functional. This chip was tweaked and then brought through numerous revisions as basic functionality was brought up and features, well, started to, well, work. From what I understand, AMD had been running behind on getting some of the features ready for RDNA 2, and I was told that these features were physically on some of the prototype chips, but they were disabled because the chip could not run with any decent amount of speed when they were enabled. I'm not going to reveal what those clocks were. Also, at this point, the silicon was being produced on not the current process. The GitHub results, therefore, were actually very old by the time they had even leaked, and had already been internally replaced by much newer hardware. I'll stress again, the GitHub results were not current, not even slightly current. And, to be honest, the PS5 Aerial hardware, when they were current, did not really resemble what you could call a console. Hell, you could not even really call it a development kit. You can pretty much say that this thing was held together by duct tape, string, and the tears of the people working on it. It's basically just a little more than a pile of circuits which function roughly to approximate what the performance of the final hardware would be during the bring-up. Next was Oberon, again, another revision of the GPU. This was hinted at GitHub and also several folks such as Komachi and also Rogue Game. The PS5 APU, or more accurately, the GPU section, was starting to come together, and by the time the third major revision of the GPU architecture came out, well, it was more in the shape of the development kits you're starting to see spring up online. Much of this work was really hitting its stride in 2018, but planning and internal testing had started way prior to this, and had been influenced by a lot of the early feedback for the PS4 Pro. Also, what the weaknesses of the initial PS4 was too. There's a lot of lessons that both Sony and Microsoft took from the older consoles, and perhaps, honestly, the manufacturer which learnt those lessons best was Microsoft, with major changes to their approach with the Xbox Series X, a radical change in direction first hinted at with the Xbox One X. Earlier this year, I went on record and said that I believe the PS5 has what in the PC space you could call RDNA-free features. You can just do a Google of Red Gaming Tech, RDNA-free PS5, and it will pop right up, especially late April, early May. And I also said that I was certain the PS5 had variable rate shading support too. I got a lot of criticism for this, but I strongly believed that the PS5 had custom features which would later influence AMD's roadmap, like with the original PS4, and how it influenced the number of asynchronous compute engines and compute queues on AMD's GPUs, as these numbers would be bumped up for later desktop GPUs from AMD. I am almost 100% positive that this is the case. Recently there's been an internet storm by a Sony employee working on the PlayStation graphics architecture. I don't want to mention his name, once again because of privacy reasons. He'd stated that the PS5 was somewhere between RDNA 1 and 2, but then, well, made a new statement to say that this wasn't accurate. He was tired and made a mistake. I firmly believe this is because he was Italian, just tired, trying to communicate in English, and honestly, it's understandable. Given my lack of ability to communicate in other languages, honestly, I can only commend him to be able to speak the way he can. Indeed, his new statement says that the PS5 GPU is based on RDNA 2, though is a custom design and has several features which are not found in RDNA 2 architecture. This is how I reported my initial leaks. I've reached out to several people and I have a reasonable overview of the PS5 GPU. It is based on RDNA 2 but highly customized. The GPU is missing some features from the desktop implementation of RDNA 2 in terms of features, but the way it was explained to me, these features were removed on purpose by Sony because they felt that they would not benefit the PS5 as a console. These features removed are not things like hardware-based ray tracing, but instead functionality Sony either had amended or improved with their own custom work on the silicon, or simply found the features were pointless because they are not applicable to a console. To be clear, this is a choice by Sony for the PS5, and this saved die space is going to be important for reasons such as heat and power, but also that space for meaningful other stuff on the die itself. RDNA 2 is a marketing term, and it's used to kind of clump together specific features. And it's really designed for users to be able to easily understand what they're buying. Think of this as like saying RTX 20 from Nvidia and comparing that to RTX 30 or GTX 10. The underlying architecture and design are what matters here, not the name. A marketing name is for public, and it's not the same thing as internally being worked on by AMD, which are features and technology. I do want to keep this short, and I don't want to go super technical into this, but bring-ups of design take years, and before any hardware is even, well, hardware, after the initial design is finished, the chip starts in pre-silicon. Basically, think of this as modelling inside of a computer, and this sees what is not and what is functional. For example, they can very easily eliminate major problems with the chip. We actually saw this with the Xbox Series X GPU in the GitHub results. This was pre-silicon. They were also super old at the time of the leak and a lot less comprehensive than the PlayStation info, although we did at the time know that this gave us at least some insight into the clock frequency and the number of CU in the Xbox, which of course was way more than what Sony had for the PlayStation. AMD uses multiple teams and they work on different silicon at once. They call this a leapfrog design approach. For example, a team would be finishing RDNA 1 and would be feeding this information of the early results, the testing, and the bring-up of RDNA 2, and this would be for another team. And then those two teams would also simultaneously be giving information to another team that would be working RDNA 3, which, by the way, is already long into design. In fact, AMD themselves, A, have confirmed this, and B, I already know that RDNA 4 is also in the initial planning stages or possibly design. This means that terms like RDNA 1, 2, 3, Polaris, Vega, it means a lot less for custom hardware than a desktop. Take the PS4 for example. The PS4 Pro added features like Rapid Pack Math. Cerny and his team also implemented things like Primitive Discard Accelerator, and these were Vega features, that is the Vega architecture, which was the successor to Polaris, which is what the PS4 Pro architecture was largely based upon. And Sony are not a special snowflake. They are not unique. AMD always tweaks its architecture as it needs to for its client. It's done it in the past, and it will continue to do so. For example, it's tweaking the Zen architecture and other things for the Frontier supercomputer too. Now, let's take the flexible clocks of the PS5 APU. People are stating that this was a last-minute decision. And once again, this is just mind-boggling to me. It's impossible for it to be a last-minute bloody decision. It cannot be done. It's implemented deeply into the silicon level. It monitors tons of different things of power usage of every element of the APU and shifts power around multiple times in just a few milliseconds. Indeed, I originally reported that this was within the budget of the time it takes to render one frame with a 120 Hz image, which is fast. I can now tell you that it's way faster than that. It's just 2 or 3 milliseconds, which is really fast. Really fast. But anyway, you cannot implement this stuff in just 6 or 12 months. This technology, by the way, is similar to Smart Shift with AMD's Renoir APUs, but it's more advanced. This is something that would require a massive overhaul of the APU, and indeed most of the internal systems to implement. You can't do this last minute. I'm also fairly certain at this point that the PS5 GPU has an improved geometry handling component compared to RDNA 2 thanks to the geometry block on the silicon. I leaked this earlier that the GE was designed around the desire for Sony to create a way better programmable and customizable geometry setup stages of the GPU. And indeed, culling was a big aspect to this. In my video detailing the Geometry Engine and some of the changes, I said that God of War could apparently have been run on the PS4 Pro without as much stress on the system, reducing fan noise, for example, if the developers had been able to have a bit more control over the culling of the geometry. Yes, primitive discard was added from Vega to Polaris, but it wasn't customizable enough for Sony, and certainly not the developers. And honestly, that's the most important thing, the people who are writing the damn code. The Geometry Engine is not a unique term for the PlayStation 5. If you do a quick Google for GE, well, you'll see that Polaris has it. And certainly, this phrase was used even back in the 80s. Seriously, do a Google and you'll find a crap ton, that's a technical term, of these results. What is unique, though, as always, is how it's created, tweaked, and designed. This is not a great analogy necessarily, but it's like saying CPU. It's just a term. The underlying technology is what's important. We've seen recently some patents emerge which show how Sony has crafted the GE specifically for the PS5 hardware. The patent is lengthy, and thanks to those who linked me to it, by the way. The patent is technical, and I don't want to go in depth here because this video is already going to be long enough, and I don't think it's the right video for it anyway. But the tech is pretty impressive. I'll link the patent in the description. The GE can adjust pixel density, improve efficiency in rendering pipeline, and is over 2 times as efficient. I've previously confirmed in a leak that the PS5 GE is also very important for VR experiences. And the goal, of course, with VR is to hit 120 Hz ideally. Long story short, I believe that RDNA 3 will likely benefit from many of the improvements we saw with the geometry pipeline from the PlayStation, and likely spurred on by the developments of the Geometry Engine for the PlayStation 5. There is a lot of custom work for the PS5 for a lot of reasons, including also things like backwards compatibility. RDNA 3 will also bring other changes too. I'm hearing drastically improved caching, for example, perhaps bigger caches on the GPU, and possibly some of that was spurred on by the PS5, and there are also some other things which I'm not allowed to talk about. RDNA 3 design is basically finished at this point. We saw RDNA 2 benchmarks pop up very early January this year too. AMD is committing to an RDNA 3 release by 2022, so none of this is too surprising. Also, I want to take pause because I'm regularly asked about mesh shader support for the PS5. This is a very complicated question. A very simplified explanation of mesh shaders is that they allow graphics workloads to be run as essentially compute commands on the GPU, which is way more efficient and customizable compared to the traditional geometry pipeline. Microsoft adding mesh shaders to DX12 was excellent, and actually we saw Nvidia really push for mesh shading before the DX12 implementation with Turing. This was back in 2018. You can, by the way, watch one of my videos where I delve deeply into DX12 Ultimate and why it's amazing, which is linked in the description if I remember. If not, you can search Red Gaming Tech DX12 Ultimate. For mesh shading, though, it's handled very differently on the PS5 to my knowledge. I'm not fully aware of the lower level functionality. But from my understanding, the PS5 has equivalent functionality, which seems to revolve at least partly around the Geometry Engine. As I said, I lack the finer details to explain the full workings here, and I don't want to give misinformation. But what I was told is essentially there are alternatives which are just as tweakable as mesh shading. As for features like variable rate shading, well, to my knowledge, PSVRS can run in tandem with the Geometry Engine, and indeed, that's not even a fair statement. It's really benefits heavily from the GE. I've spoken about VRS on the PS5 several times, including initially confirmed that it exists. Well, VRS with the GE is more efficient. It's not only more selective and accurate in terms of how the VRS functions, but it can also provide some other performance saving too on the data, but I've been asked to not speak about that in depth from certain people. I also want to pause the PS5 discussion for a moment and talk about the Xbox. Microsoft's choices with the Xbox Series X are not, well, a non-version of RDNA 2, which is another thing that I'm hearing, which is ridiculous. The Xbox Series X does not have large missing features compared to the desktop implementation. The only difference is the number of compute units. Back when I first saw reports of hardware-based ray tracing of VRS being baked into DX12 for the PC, I said Microsoft were likely paving the way for those features to come to a console. Obviously, Microsoft have since confirmed DX12 Ultimate, and this API is cross-platform. It's designed so that a minimum feature set can be targeted for both the Xbox and PC by developers. Or, to put it another way, if a developer targets DX12 Ultimate on PC, those features will happily run on the Xbox, though you'll need to tweak and optimize as you would with any console hardware, ever. Microsoft have also done some very impressive custom work to the GPU, though I don't think it's as extensive as Sony, but it's still very impressive. An obvious example of this is the tweak for backwards compatibility and HDRing, technical term, for older content. It's very impressive, and honestly is a great reason to purchase the Xbox and play games on it. I'm also told developers have been working on Forza for the console and apparently are very happy. Yes, it supports tech like VRS, but really it's not just that. Some of the additional power we're seeing from the CPU apparently is allowing developers to crank physics up massively, especially on a per-frame basis. I think it's going to be very impressive to see what Microsoft come up with over the next few years. And also, both the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 benefit heavily from the IPC and efficiency uplift from RDNA 1 to 2. And I'd also like to throw a few extra things here. I'm way less certain of this information as it's a mishmash from several people, and some of this info is not from sources I've previously turned out to be very accurate. See my RDNA 2 ray tracing, Ryzen 3000 release date, Radeon 7 information, PS5 cooling, and why Sony haven't shown off the PS5, RTX 20 refresh information, and more. But I was told much of this will be laid to rest in terms of debate by August. I know that there's supposedly going to be a teardown for the PS5, where the cooling and overview of the APU will take place. Sony has stated this for the Road to PS5 event, but did not give a date, and I was told it was by the end of August. But whether this is just a teardown, or whether it's at some game-focused event, I don't know honestly. I will report, though, that Microsoft, of course, will be doing the same for the Hot Chips conference, going through an overview of the system rather extensively as to its features. And that's in August, so the two companies doing something in August makes some level of sense. I'm also way less certain about this, but I heard something regarding the ray tracing aspects of the GPU. And I was told that it is based on RDNA 2. Much like the Xbox Series X, but allegedly it's customized some by Sony. I don't know the exact details here, and I would take this with a truckload of salt. Seriously, a massive truckload of salt. As this is not from a regular source, so take it as a theory, not confirmation. And I told Moore's Law about this in a DM, but I just want to stress that I did not tell him that this info is solid. I would take it with a massive truckload of salt. But anyway, I was told it is based on RDNA 2, but I was told that the PS5 can run different frequencies of ray tracing calculations when running RT. I don't have the architecture specifics, so I don't know whether its RT cores themselves are decoupled, or whether it's the CU, or whether this is true at all. The only reason I have any faith in this rumour, and once again, take this as it is that one of my more reliable sources hinted to me that specific CU of the PS5 can operate possibly at higher clock speeds, and basically can be almost independent of the entire GPU. In the context I was told this though, he made it seem like the CPU needs to hit 3.5 GHz and the GPU is not fully saturated, let's say not all of the CU is used, then some of those CU can run at lower clock speeds to save power budget. So I'm unsure if I believe this RT info. If it is true, and once again, I don't know if it is, I'd be very interested to see how it's implemented. I'd also like to discuss the SSD inside the PS5, though technically speaking, it could also be for the Xbox too. And that is that it can be updated via microcode. I'm pretty confident, by the way, in this info, especially for the PlayStation. If you remember with the PS4 launch, Sony released an update which allowed the console to output in HDR, even the original launch unit. But this is not doable on the Xbox. And this is because Sony allowed the HDMI chipset in their console to be field updatable, and Microsoft had not done that with their console, thus the need to launch the Xbox One X and Xbox One S. I'm told that Sony have provided this ability for the SSD. Well, this would allow higher levels of compression than what we're currently seeing, although, to be clear, this is compressed data, not raw throughput. This is not an update to the hardware, but a better compression algorithm, which will squeeze more data out of the SSD. I think as well that Microsoft could do this with the Xbox Series X, especially given the Velocity architecture. It relies on software and decompression too. This is assuming they've not locked it off from updates. I wouldn't be surprised though, because the compressed figures of the Xbox Series X are actually conservative. This is according to a Microsoft employee. So for them to be able to update this and improve compression and performance, it makes sense. One reason to lock this off though might be for security reasons. Maybe some way to actually access code on the SSD. But I'm not a security expert, so I don't know how valid this concern is. It may be totally unfounded. I'm not speaking with knowledge there. Getting back to the flexible clocks though, I had it described to me by a developer that it's not just the CPU and GPU which can adjust. Instead, other elements of the system can adjust in performance as needed. The Tempest engine, which is responsible largely for audio, can divert some of its power budget, according to one person I spoke to, albeit not one of my regular sources. We know that the TE can help out in specific tasks in the console, according to Sony, which are not audio. And so it seems that depending on what's going on, the Tempest engine can either be used in full for its audio, or offload tasks, or divert power for other things, such as the GPU. Remember, all of this happens tons of times a second, hundreds of times a second. Sony has said that in the Road to PS5 event that the TE is basically a modified compute unit, capable of about the same performance of the PS4 CPU. Someone actually told me that's about 100 G-flops of performance, which makes sense given the performance amount of the Jaguar. If this information is accurate, it could also help with GPU tasks, but apparently it really does a good job of offloading certain CPU work. To be clear, I mean non-audio tasks. I'm not clear how this functions, but apparently for basic optimization it's very easy, with SDKs from Sony basically having, I'm paraphrasing here, like a button where you can just optimize if a developer doesn't want to go in and do heavy optimization by hand. I've also mentioned in another video that the PS5 has tweaks to the CPU. I got it heavily hinted that the CCX of the CPU is unified like Zen 3, but the actual architecture itself is not really Zen 3 based. I believe this is for reduced latency when accessing different clusters of cache, and also predictability to those caches. Once again, I've gone into this extensively, I'll link it in the video description. There's also the requirements for custom tweaking anyway, because like the GPU, Sony needs to ensure that the CPU can run at the approximate clocks for backwards compatibility, and also things like disabling SMT, I believe. The next bit of information comes to me via a less known source, but isn't specific about the PlayStation, it's more about UE5. But it was told to me in relation to the PlayStation 5, so, well, I'll round it up here. You might be familiar with the UE5 PS5 demo. I mean, it did go largely unnoticed and didn't really gain much traction online, so you probably didn't see it. Anyway, I did some investigation and analysis of this already, but there's a lot of tech which has not been shown off to the public yet. The engine is not released until next year, although there will be a beta early in the year, but the actual official release isn't until later next year, and games are probably not going to come out until 2021 late, possibly 2022, which use this. But Lumen and Nanite were heavily demoed, with Lumen being the real-time global illumination system, and Nanite, well, that's kind of the geometry data loading tech. Anyway, it uses a less taxing approach than the traditional ray tracing effects with, say, NVIDIA's RTX, and instead uses real-time global illumination, which is ultimately a software-based solution. However, I'm told that this can be hardware accelerated for the PlayStation. I believe, though, that this can also happen with the Xbox too, given it's really down to the SDK. This is going to be very interesting, because it's going to, of course, mean developers are able to optimize and tweak accordingly. Moore's Law also recently asked me about a PS5 upgrade chance, and asked if I knew any specifics. I told him in a DM that there is a tiny possibility of 38 compute units given the really good yields, although, as I said in my recent Will the Consoles Get a Spec Bump video, linked in the description, that's if the GPU of the PS5 can run with 38 enabled, and given the nature of WGPs of RDNA, we just don't know if RDNA 2 is different here, and more to the point, if the PS5 can do it. It's possible, therefore, of a few alternatives. One is that the PS5 could instead enable all 40 compute units, but this would mean Sony has no margin of error on defective chips, even if the failure rate is only 1 or 2%, which would be honestly pretty damn amazing. That's tens of thousands of chips which are not usable, which obviously is not good from a profitability standpoint, especially given the PS5 is not exactly going to cost them $2.50 to produce. I personally think that we have a couple of other more likely scenarios. One is that the clock speeds will be better. Higher quality silicon could clock higher for the same amount of power, for example, or we could see other bumps in specs, such as faster memory. One of my earlier PS5 sources mentioned that Sony of Japan were having arguments with Sony America as to the amount of bandwidth that the console should have. Apparently the plan at the time was to go with the more conservative figure, and I don't know whether the US or Japan was pushing for faster memory. I think it was America that wanted the faster RAM, but I could be wrong, just from the wording that I had from my source. By the way, that same source was also accurate on several other things, including, but not limited to, some of the PS VR information. The good thing is, though, that the PS5 has a very good, robust caching system, and really good data compression, which helps too. But no developer ever has said, yeah, actually, I don't want extra bandwidth. This decision would not be last minute, because securing faster RAM, let's say 16 Gbps rather than 14, which would mean 512 GB per second rather than 448 GB per second, well, they would have needed to work with suppliers, and it's just not something that's easy to do last minute. For Microsoft, though, I think that the best option is a clock speed bump, going from 1825 with 52 compute units to 1900 MHz with the same 52 compute units, means we're looking at about 12.6 teraflops rather than 12.1. But screw that. Really, the improvements in caching speed as well as other elements of the chip are the real win here. The geometry units on the GPU would run faster, and some effects do not scale as well across all of the shaders and so on. Microsoft doing this would have a tremendous boost on the system. And honestly, given Microsoft's history, it wouldn't surprise me if they did. They bumped the spec of the Xbox One with the CPU and GPU alike last minute, so doing this again would be right in line with what we've seen previously. Is this a certainty? By no means. But again, I have been told that because the yields are good for both companies, don't be surprised if this occurs. How the specs will change though, well, that's interesting. And honestly, we can only wait until we see official teardowns anyway. And for the last question, what about the Pro systems? I'll talk about that in a separate video, along with the possibility of handhelds from both companies. Although, before I do, I did want to take a moment to just talk about the whole console war thing. For those who are about to scream at me I'm a Sony fanboy or whatever, please don't. I've owned an Xbox, every single PlayStation, loads of Nintendo consoles. I grew up playing Sega, and honestly, I'm a PC gamer primarily. Frankly, I don't care if Sony bails out of the console race tomorrow and says that they're done with it. They actually made a mistake. Don't want to do it anymore. I don't care if the PS5 sells free consoles. I don't care if the Xbox sells free consoles. All I care about, and this is the most important thing, is do we, as people actually coughing up money to buy these systems, get fun games? And, well, if the answer is yes, then great. Ultimately, my main loyalty is down to you, the people watching the video. Now, I try my best, of course, to be as certain as I am with the information that I report, and once I've done as much due diligence as I can, I present it down to you, and then you can make your own mind up. With that said, yeah, I don't really have a loyalty. I like Microsoft. I've recently covered the Xbox conference, and I'm really hyped about a few games we saw, like Medium. I'm super excited about Fable, for example. But also, the PC is going to benefit from all of this stuff too. And the PC, as regular viewers know, is actually where my heart lies. I'm really hyped about some stuff that's releasing on PC in terms of hardware, like Ryzen 4000 towards the end of the year, Nvidia's Ampere architecture, RDNA 2, of course, when it comes to desktop, blah, blah, blah. In other words, I'm reporting what I feel is accurate, and feelings aside, I don't care about console wars, I just want cool hardware and games. So then, what are my thoughts with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X? I think both systems are going to be very cool. I want to go further into the Halo Infinite thing, as that is not a simple situation. And honestly, Microsoft probably shouldn't have shown off that build. It was a very early build of Halo Infinite, so I'm going to talk about some of that later on, and possibly some drama behind the scenes. I need to get permission from my source if I can actually talk about some of the things he's told me, so it's kind of sketchy. And I think Microsoft, in the grand scheme of things, will be in pretty good shape for the next generation. I'm really happy, for example, about Xbox Game Pass as well. And I don't think enough people are appreciating the value of Game Pass. I've got Game Pass, and I absolutely love it. I think it's really good. I think Microsoft will be in really good shape for the next generation. I just think it's going to take them a couple of years, honestly, to fully hit their stride, simply because some of the development kits went out late, and the same thing, by the way, for the PlayStation 2. I was recently told that developers have only recently started to get mass-produced development kits for the PS5, and those do have some changes compared to the older kits. And from what I understand, they've got a little bit more optimization in terms of features and some other bits and pieces as well. I can't really say too much about that, unfortunately. And this, of course, does mean that, as always with every console generation, the first wave of games is not going to be indicative of 2-3 years down the line when developers get a handle on these things. And make no mistake about it, these consoles, although they're fairly easy to use compared to what we saw with, let's say, the PS3 with the cell processor, they're also not just like you know, really simple either. Especially if you want to delve in and do customization to the code to optimize for best performance. Hardware-based ray tracing alone is going to be something that developers need to figure out. And certain game engines too aren't optimized yet for the next gen. UE5, of course, releases late next year. UE4 with the later versions, I think it's 4.24, fully supports certain implementations of hardware-based ray tracing. 4.25 also supports some other cool stuff. Unity as well as updated stuff, blah, 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 blah. The bottom line is, though, a lot of developers and of game engines are just not ready yet fully for the next gen. And this is just how it is. And I think some of the world situation, which I can't actually say because YouTube has not helped anything either. I think that's definitely hindered the performance, or rather the development of some of these projects. Personally, I'm hyped for the next generation. I just think that, as always, if you are someone who is expecting the very best visuals immediately, you're going to have to wait. Is that going to be worth buying one of these consoles at launch? Honestly, I'm not sold on either yet. It's going to take more than this to really sell me on one of the systems. When I know the launch lineup, when I know the price of the systems, and I actually know roughly the schedule of game releases. Like, for example, I bought the PS2 when it first launched, and then there was, like, not kidding, like 4 or 5 months, I literally was only playing Tekken Tag, because there was not much else I wanted. And eventually other games came out like Devil May Cry, which was really awesome, but until then there was just not much that I was playing. And the same thing for Xbox 360. For ages, all I was playing was like Perfect Dark with a friend, completed Cameo with him, and then I can't even remember the next game that I bought, honestly. It was ages afterwards. We were just playing multiplayer Perfect Dark, which, by the way, Perfect Dark Zero was really fun online. It was like my first online gaming experience with a console. Before that, though, I'd been gaming on PC, obviously online, for some time. So I'm going to be very interested to see what these plans are long-term for both systems. And with that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff, if you did, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.